The morning sun painted the Afghan mountains in shades of gold and crimson as Commander David Mitchell surveyed the valley below through his binoculars. His weathered hands gripped the field glasses steady despite the bitter mountain wind that whipped across the rocky outcrop where he and his team had taken position. 3 years of leading reconnaissance missions in these unforgiving peaks had taught him to read the landscape like a book, but today something felt different. Something felt wrong. "Sir, we've got movement in Sector 7, whispered Sergeant Torres, his voice barely audible above the howling wind. The young soldier's eyes never left his scope as he tracked something in the distance. "Looks like a patrol, maybe 6 or 7 hostiles." Mitchell lowered his binoculars and crawled to Torres's position, his camouflaged uniform scraping against the jagged rocks. The terrain here was brutal, all sharp edges and loose stones that could send a man tumbling hundreds of feet with one wrong step. They were positioned on a narrow ledge that jutted out from the main cliff face, offering perfect visibility of the valley but leaving them dangerously exposed if discovered. "Distance?" Mitchell asked, accepting the rifle scope from Torres. 800 meters, moving northeast along the ridge line. Torres pointed toward a series of rocky formations that snaked across the opposite mountainside. "They're trying to stay in the shadows, but the sun's working against them." Through the scope, Mitchell could make out the unmistakable silhouettes of armed figures moving in single file along a goat path that carved its way through the rocks. They moved with purpose, not the casual gait of locals going about their daily business. These were fighters, and they were heading directly toward the village that housed the forward operating base where Mitchell's unit was stationed. "Collins, radio this in," Mitchell ordered, sliding back from the edge. "Tell them we have confirmed enemy movement. Sector 7. Estimated 7 combatants heading toward the village." Private Collins, barely 22 years old with freckles that made him look even younger, fumbled with the radio equipment. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted the frequency dial, whether from cold or nerves Mitchell couldn't tell. The kid had only been with the unit for 2 months, fresh out of training, and still jumping at every shadow. "Base, this is Eagle Eye, do you copy?" Collins spoke into the handset, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. Static filled the air for several long seconds before a voice crackled through. "Eagle Eye, this is Base. We copy. Send your traffic." As Collins relayed their observations, Mitchell studied the tactical situation. Their position offered excellent surveillance of the valley, but it also left them trapped if discovered. The cliff face behind them dropped nearly 300 feet to a rocky slope covered in loose scree and twisted metal from old conflicts. To their left and right, the ledge narrowed to barely 2 feet wide before disappearing entirely. The only way out was the treacherous path they had climbed that morning, a route that would take at least an hour to navigate safely. "Sir," Torres called softly, urgency creeping into his voice. "We've got a problem." Mitchell crawled back to the observation point and accepted the scope. What he saw made his blood run cold. The enemy patrol had changed direction and was now moving directly toward their position. Worse, they had spread out in a tactical formation that suggested they knew exactly where the American team was hiding. "They made us," Mitchell muttered, his mind racing through their limited options. "Collins, tell Base we've been compromised and are moving to secondary position." But even as the words left his mouth, Mitchell knew there was no secondary position. They had chosen this ledge precisely because it offered the best vantage point in the area, but that same advantage now worked against them. They were sitting ducks on a rocky shelf with nowhere to run. The sound of boots on stone echoed from the path below, growing closer with each passing second. Mitchell could hear voices speaking in Pashto, calm and controlled. These weren't amateur fighters stumbling through the mountains. They were professionals who had successfully tracked and cornered a highly trained American reconnaissance team. "Weapons check," Mitchell whispered, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had led soldiers through a dozen firefights. "Torres, you've got the high ground on the right. Collins, stay with the radio and be ready to call in air support. Morrison, watch our 6. Staff Sergeant Morrison, a career soldier with gray at his temples and scars from 2 previous deployments, nodded grimly. He had been Mitchell's second-in-command for over a year, and the 2 men had developed the kind of wordless communication that kept soldiers alive in impossible situations. The first enemy fighter appeared on the path below, moving cautiously but with the confidence of someone who knew his prey was trapped. He carried an AK-47 with practiced ease, his finger resting alongside the trigger guard in proper combat position. Behind him, Mitchell could see at least 5 more fighters making their way up the narrow trail. "Contact front," Torres whispered, his rifle already trained on the lead enemy soldier. Mitchell raised his hand, signaling his team to hold fire. Starting a gunfight from their current position would be suicide. The enemy had superior numbers and could easily surround their tiny perch. Their only hope was to remain hidden and pray that the fighters would pass by without spotting them. But hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. One of the enemy soldiers looked up directly at their hiding spot and pointed, shouting something in his native language. The man's eyes locked with Mitchell's for a brief moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. "Contact!" Mitchell shouted, all pretense of stealth abandoned. The mountain erupted in gunfire. Muzzle flashes lit up the shadowy crevices between the rocks as both sides opened up with everything they had. The sound was deafening, echoing off the cliff faces and multiplying until it seemed like an entire army was engaged in battle. Torres's rifle cracked steadily as he picked targets with the precision of a seasoned marksman. His first shot dropped the lead fighter, sending the man tumbling backward into his companions. His second shot caught another fighter in the shoulder, spinning him around before he disappeared behind a boulder. Collins crouched low over his radio, shouting coordinates and requesting immediate air support while bullets whined overhead. His young face was pale with fear, but his voice remained steady as he transmitted their desperate situation to anyone who could help. Morrison had spotted movement on their left flank and was engaging fighters who were trying to work their way around to a flanking position. His M249 light machine gun chattered in short, controlled bursts that sent streams of tracer rounds into the enemy positions. But, despite their training and determination, Mitchell could see that the situation was hopeless. More fighters were arriving every minute, and they were systematically surrounding the small American position. Grenades began exploding against the cliff face, showering them with rock fragments and filling the air with choking dust. "We need to move," Morrison shouted over the gunfire. "They're going to overrun us." Mitchell looked around desperately for any escape route, but there was nowhere to go. The path they had used to reach this position was now controlled by enemy fighters. The cliff face behind them was a sheer drop that no one could survive. They were trapped like animals in a cage. A rocket-propelled grenade streaked past Mitchell's head and exploded against the rocks behind him, the blast wave throwing him forward onto his face. When he looked up, he saw that Collins was down, blood streaming from a head wound. The radio lay smashed beside him, their lifeline to the outside world severed. "Collins!" Mitchell crawled to the young soldier's side, checking for a pulse while bullets continued to snap overhead. The boy was alive, but unconscious, probably concussed from the explosion. Torres was still firing, but Mitchell could see that they were running low on ammunition. The enemy fighters had taken cover in positions that were nearly impossible to hit, while they poured accurate fire into the small ledge where the Americans were trapped. An enemy voice called out in accented English from somewhere below. "American soldiers, you are surrounded. Surrender now, and you will be treated according to the laws of war." Mitchell knew better than to trust such promises. He had seen what happened to captured American soldiers in this part of the world. If they surrendered, they would face interrogation, torture, and eventual execution, probably filmed for propaganda purposes. "What do you think, sir?" Morrison asked, reloading his weapon with their last belt of ammunition. Mitchell looked at his team, 3 good soldiers who had followed him into this impossible situation. Collins was still unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. Torres was bleeding from a cut on his cheek, but continued to scan for targets through his rifle scope. Morrison waited calmly for orders, ready to follow his commander's decision, whatever it might be. "We fight," Mitchell said simply. The battle resumed with renewed intensity. The enemy fighters, frustrated by the Americans' refusal to surrender, began a coordinated assault on the position. They came from 3 directions at once, using covering fire and movement tactics that spoke of professional military training. Torres picked off 2 fighters who tried to rush their position from the right, but a third man made it close enough to throw a grenade that exploded just feet from their defensive line. The blast lifted Morrison off his feet and slammed him into the rock wall behind them. He slumped to the ground, his machine gun falling silent. Morrison. Mitchell scrambled to his sergeant's side, but one look told him everything he needed to know. Morrison's eyes were open but, seeing nothing, a piece of shrapnel having found its way through a gap in his body armor. Now it was just Mitchell and Torres against at least a dozen enemy fighters who were closing in from all sides. They had perhaps 50 rounds of ammunition left between them, and no way to call for help. The situation had moved beyond desperate into the realm of the impossible. Torres looked at his commander with eyes that held no fear, only grim determination. "Sir, it's been an honor serving with you." Before Mitchell could respond, enemy fighters appeared at both ends of their ledge simultaneously. Torres spun to engage the group on the right, while Mitchell opened fire on those coming from the left. For a few seconds, their combined firepower held back the assault, but then Mitchell felt a burning sensation in his left shoulder as a bullet found its mark. He stumbled backward, his rifle falling from numb fingers. Torres was still fighting, but Mitchell could see blood spreading across the young soldier's uniform. They were both wounded and nearly out of ammunition, facing an enemy that showed no mercy. An enemy fighter appeared directly in front of Mitchell, his rifle trained on the American commander's chest. The man's finger tightened on the trigger, and Mitchell closed his eyes, thinking of his wife and daughter back home in Colorado. The shot never came. Instead, Torres threw himself between Mitchell and the enemy fighter, taking the bullet meant for his commander. The young sergeant collapsed at Mitchell's feet, his weapon clattering away across the rocky ledge. Rage and despair filled Mitchell's heart as he watched Torres fall. He grabbed a grenade from his belt, pulled the pin, and prepared to make his last stand. If he was going to die on this godforsaken mountain, he would take as many of the enemy with him as possible. But before he could throw the grenade, rough hands seized him from behind. Enemy fighters swarmed over the position, kicking away his weapon and wresting the grenade from his grasp. Someone struck him in the head with a rifle butt, and stars exploded across his vision. Through the haze of pain and confusion, Mitchell heard voices arguing in Pashto. He couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clear enough. They were discussing what to do with their prisoner. One voice rose above the others, speaking with obvious authority. Mitchell was hauled to his feet by two fighters who gripped his arms tightly. Blood from his head wound ran down into his eyes, making it difficult to see clearly. The enemy commander stepped forward, a tall man with a black beard and intelligent eyes. He studied Mitchell for a long moment before speaking in careful English. "You are the American commander, yes? The one they call Mitchell?" Mitchell said nothing, meeting the man's gaze with as much defiance as he could muster. According to the code of conduct, he was required to give only his name, rank, and serial number. The enemy commander smiled coldly. "It does not matter if you speak or not. We know who you are. Your government has placed a very high price on your head, Commander Mitchell. You are valuable to us alive, but only if you cooperate." The man gestured to his fighters, and they began dragging Mitchell toward the edge of the cliff. Panic flooded through him as he realized what they intended. They were going to throw him off the mountain, 300 feet to the rocky slope below. "Wait!" Mitchell shouted, abandoning his silence. "You said I was valuable alive." The enemy commander paused, considering. "You are valuable, yes. But you are also dangerous. We cannot risk you escaping or being rescued. This way, your body will be found eventually, and your government will know that their most effective commander in this region is dead. It will demoralize them greatly." Mitchell struggled against the hands that held him, but the fighters were strong and determined. They dragged him to the very edge of the cliff, where loose stones scattered into the void below. The wind was stronger here, threatening to tear him from the ledge even without their assistance. He looked down at the drop that yawned beneath his feet. The slope below was covered in loose rock and scattered boulders, any one of which could break every bone in his body. Even if by some miracle he survived the fall, he would be too injured to move, left to die slowly of exposure and internal bleeding. The enemy commander raised his hand, ready to give the signal that would send Mitchell to his death. Time seemed to slow as Mitchell prepared himself for the end, thinking of his family and the soldiers who had died under his command. Then, the commander's hand fell, and Mitchell felt himself pushed forward into empty space. The world tumbled around him as he fell, the cliff face rushing past in a blur of rock and shadow. The wind roared in his ears, drowning out everything else. He struck the slope hard, his body bouncing off rocks and sliding through loose scree. Pain exploded through every nerve ending as he tumbled end over end, unable to control his descent. A boulder loomed up in front of him, and he managed to throw his arms up to protect his head just before impact. Darkness claimed him as he rolled to a stop at the bottom of the slope, his broken body coming to rest among the twisted metal and scattered stones of a dozen previous battles. Above him, the enemy fighters watched for a moment to ensure he was dead before disappearing back up the mountain path. Commander David Mitchell lay motionless in the shadow of the cliff, his breathing shallow and his pulse barely detectable. Blood seeped from multiple wounds, staining the rocky ground beneath him. As the sun began to set behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the valley, it seemed certain that another American soldier had given his life in the endless war among the mountains of Afghanistan. But, in wars like this, death and survival often hang on the thinnest of threads, and sometimes help comes from the most unexpected places. As darkness fell across the mountain valley, other eyes were watching, other hands were moving, and Mitchell's story was far from over. Elena Vasquez had been watching the firefight through her scope from a concealed position nearly a mile away when she saw the American commander thrown from the cliff. The former Marine Corps sniper lay motionless behind her custom-built rifle, her breathing controlled and steady despite the horrific scene unfolding before her. Through the powerful optics of her Barrett M82A1, she could see every detail of the battle and its brutal conclusion. She had been tracking this particular group of insurgents for 3 weeks, ever since they had ambushed a supply convoy carrying medical supplies to a remote village. 8 people had died in that attack, including 2 doctors and a nurse who had volunteered to help the local population. Elena had made it her personal mission to bring these killers to justice, but she preferred to work alone, moving through the mountains like a ghost that struck without warning. Elena was not officially part of any military unit anymore. 3 years earlier, she had been the most decorated female sniper in Marine Corps history, with over 200 confirmed kills during 4 deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. But a roadside bomb had changed everything, killing her spotter and best friend while leaving Elena with injuries that should have ended her career. The military had wanted to retire her with full honors, but Elena had other plans. Now she worked as an independent contractor, taking assignments from various intelligence agencies that needed someone with her unique skills. She had no official support, no backup, and no rules of engagement beyond her own moral code. It was dangerous work that paid well, but, more importantly, it allowed her to continue fighting the war on her own terms. Through her scope, Elena watched the enemy fighters celebrating their victory over the American reconnaissance team. She counted 12 men total, all armed with automatic weapons and wearing the kind of equipment that suggested professional training. These were not simple mountain fighters struggling with outdated weapons. Someone with serious resources was backing this group. The insurgent commander stood at the edge of the cliff, looking down at where Mitchell's body had disappeared into the shadows. The man was tall and confident, carrying himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Elena had been hunting him specifically, knowing that his death would disrupt the entire network of fighters operating in this region. She could have taken the shot right then, putting a .50 caliber round through the commander's chest from nearly a mile away. Her rifle was more than capable of making such a shot, and Elena had made longer kills under worse conditions. But something held her back, a nagging feeling that the situation was more complicated than it appeared. Instead of firing, Elena continued to observe as the enemy fighters began to withdraw from their position. They moved with discipline and purpose, following predetermined routes that would take them back into the maze of caves and hidden valleys where they made their base. Elena made mental notes of their movements, adding to the intelligence picture she had been building over the past month. But her attention kept returning to the bottom of the cliff where Mitchell had fallen. Even through her powerful scope, she couldn't see any movement among the rocks and debris at the base of the slope. The fall had been brutal, and no one could be expected to survive such an impact. Yet something compelled her to keep watching that spot long after the enemy fighters had disappeared. As darkness began to fall across the valley, Elena finally packed up her rifle and began the careful descent from her observation post. She had been lying in the same position for over 6 hours, and her body protested as she moved through the complex series of stretches that kept her muscles from cramping. Sniper work required incredible patience and physical discipline, qualities that Elena had developed through years of training and combat experience. Her route down the mountain took her through terrain that would challenge even experienced climbers. Elena moved with the confidence of someone who had spent years learning to navigate in darkness, using night vision equipment and an intimate knowledge of the landscape to avoid detection. She carried minimal equipment, trusting in her ability to live off the land and improvise solutions to problems as they arose. It took her over 2 hours to work her way around the base of the mountain to the area where Mitchell had fallen. Elena approached the crash site with extreme caution, knowing that the enemy might have left observers to watch for anyone who came looking for survivors. She used every piece of cover available, moving from boulder to boulder like a shadow that barely disturbed the landscape around her. The bottom of the slope was a wasteland of broken rock and twisted metal from decades of conflict. Old artillery shells and mortar rounds had carved craters in the landscape, while rusted pieces of vehicles and aircraft created an obstacle course of jagged edges and unstable debris. Elena picked her way through this deadly maze, following the path of Mitchell's fall as best she could determine from her earlier observations. She found him wedged between 2 large boulders about 100 yards from the base of the cliff. Mitchell was unconscious and barely breathing, his body twisted at angles that suggested multiple broken bones. Blood had pooled beneath him, and Elena could see that he had sustained serious head trauma along with numerous other injuries. By all rights, he should have been dead. Elena knelt beside the unconscious commander and began a quick medical assessment. His pulse was weak but steady, and his breathing, while shallow, showed no signs of the sucking chest wounds that would indicate punctured lungs. His left arm was clearly broken, and she suspected internal injuries from the way he was positioned. But, incredibly, he seemed to have avoided the kind of massive trauma that would have been immediately fatal. Working by feel in the darkness, Elena immobilized Mitchell's obviously broken bones and applied pressure bandages to the worst of his bleeding wounds. She had extensive medical training from her military service, and field medicine had been part of her sniper curriculum. Keeping wounded soldiers alive long enough to reach proper medical care was sometimes as important as making accurate shots. But, even with first aid, Mitchell needed immediate evacuation to a proper medical facility if he was going to survive. Elena activated a small GPS beacon that would signal her location to friendly forces, then settled in to wait and keep watch over her patient. Dawn was still several hours away, and helicopter evacuations in this terrain were dangerous even in daylight. As she maintained her vigil, Elena found herself studying the man she was trying to save. Even unconscious and badly injured, Mitchell carried himself with an air of authority that spoke of natural leadership. She had heard stories about him from other operators in the field, tales of successful missions, and soldiers who would follow him anywhere. He was exactly the kind of officer the military could not afford to lose. Mitchell stirred slightly as Elena checked his wounds again, his eyes fluttering open for just a moment. He tried to speak, but only managed a weak whisper that she had to lean close to hear. "My men," he breathed, his voice filled with anguish even in his weakened state. "My men. They fought bravely," Elena told him quietly, not knowing if he could understand her words but hoping her tone would be reassuring. "You all fought bravely." Mitchell's eyes focused on her face with difficulty, confusion evident in his gaze. He was clearly struggling to understand who she was and how she had found him. Elena placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, applying pressure to keep him from trying to sit up. "Don't move," she whispered. "You're badly hurt, but help is coming. Just stay still and try to conserve your strength." Before Mitchell could respond, he slipped back into unconsciousness, his body going limp against the rocks. Elena checked his vital signs again and was relieved to find that his pulse remained steady. The man was tougher than he looked, fighting to stay alive despite injuries that would have killed most people. The sound of distant helicopter rotors reached Elena's ears just as the first rays of dawn began to illuminate the mountain peaks. She activated a small strobe light to mark their position, knowing that the pilot would be using night vision equipment to navigate in the uncertain light of early morning. Helicopter evacuations in mountain terrain were among the most dangerous missions military pilots could fly, and Elena wanted to make their job as easy as possible. The helicopter that appeared over the ridge was a modified Black Hawk painted in the flat colors of a special operations unit. Elena recognized the aircraft as belonging to one of the elite medical evacuation teams that specialized in retrieving personnel from hostile territory. The pilot brought the aircraft into a hover just above their position, fighting the mountain winds that threatened to slam the helicopter into the rocks. A medic fast roped down from the helicopter, landing with practiced ease despite the difficult terrain. He was followed by another medic and a security specialist who immediately began scanning the area for threats while his teammates focused on the wounded man. "What's his condition?" the lead medic asked Elena as he knelt beside Mitchell. "Multiple fractures, possible internal injuries, definite concussion," Elena reported, her voice carrying the crisp professionalism of someone with military training. "He's been unconscious for most of the night, but his vital signs have remained stable." The medics worked with efficient speed, starting in 4-line and immobilizing Mitchell's injuries with professional-grade medical equipment. Within minutes, they had him loaded onto a stretcher and ready for evacuation. The entire rescue operation took less than 10 minutes from the time the helicopter arrived to when it lifted off again with Mitchell safely aboard. Elena watched the aircraft disappear over the mountains, carrying Mitchell toward the trauma center at Bagram Airfield, where military surgeons would fight to save his life. She felt a sense of satisfaction knowing that she had been able to prevent at least one senseless death in this endless war. But her work was far from finished. The enemy fighters who had killed Mitchell's team were still out there, and Elena intended to make them pay for their crimes. She had memorized their faces during the firefight, and she knew their general area of operations. It might take weeks or even months, but she would hunt them down one by one until justice was served. Elena began the long climb back to her concealed cache of equipment, already planning her next move against the insurgent network. She moved through the mountain landscape with the patience of a natural predator, completely at home in this harsh environment that had claimed so many lives. The war might be endless, but warriors like Elena made sure that it came with a price for those who chose to fight against innocent people. Behind her, the crash site returned to its silent vigil over the valley below, marked only by a few spots of blood on the rocks, and the fading trail of the helicopter that had carried Mitchell to safety. In a few hours, the mountain winds would erase even these small signs that anything significant had happened in this remote corner of Afghanistan. But Elena would remember, and that memory would fuel her in the battles to come. Some wars were fought by armies and governments, while others were fought by individuals who refused to let evil go unpunished. Elena Vasquez had chosen her side long ago, and she would continue fighting until there was no fight left in her. The legend of the ghost sniper who protected American forces in the Afghan mountains would grow over the coming months, as enemy fighters began disappearing one by one under circumstances that no one could explain. But that was a story for another day. For now, Elena had a wounded warrior to check on and enemies to hunt. As she reached her equipment cache and began preparing for the next phase of her mission, Elena allowed herself a small smile. Mitchell would survive, and she would make sure the men who had tried to kill him would not. In the brutal mathematics of war, it was a fair trade. Commander David Mitchell woke up in a sterile white room that smelled of antiseptic and floor polish. The steady beeping of medical monitors filled the silence, punctuated by the distant sounds of a busy hospital. His body felt like it had been run over by a tank, every muscle and bone screaming in protest as consciousness slowly returned. Through the fog of pain medication, he gradually became aware of his surroundings. His left arm was encased in a heavy cast that extended from his fingertips to his shoulder, suspended by a complex system of pulleys and counterweights. Thick bandages covered most of his head, leaving only his eyes and mouth exposed. When he tried to move, sharp pains shot through his torso, suggesting cracked or broken ribs beneath the hospital gown. A nurse entered the room just as Mitchell was attempting to sit up, her quick steps crossing the linoleum floor with practiced efficiency. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing the insignia of a Navy lieutenant commander on her uniform collar. "Commander Mitchell, please don't try to move yet," she said gently but firmly, placing a restraining hand on his good shoulder. "You've been through quite an ordeal, and your body needs time to heal." "Where am I?" Mitchell asked, his voice coming out as a harsh whisper through his damaged throat. "Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany," the nurse explained as she checked the various monitors connected to his body. "You've been here for 6 days. The doctors had to perform emergency surgery to repair internal bleeding and set multiple fractures. You're lucky to be alive, Commander." Mitchell tried to process this information, but his memories of recent events were fragmented and confused. He remembered the firefight on the mountain ledge, watching his men die one by one as they were overwhelmed by enemy fighters. He remembered being dragged to the edge of the cliff and thrown into empty space. But everything after that was blank until waking up in this hospital bed. "My team," he said, struggling to focus despite the medication clouding his thoughts. "What happened to my team?" The nurse's expression grew somber, and she pulled a chair close to his bed before sitting down. This was clearly a conversation she had been preparing for, waiting for Mitchell to regain enough consciousness to understand what she had to tell him. "I'm sorry, Commander," she said softly. "Staff Sergeant Morrison, Sergeant Torres, and Private Collins were all killed in action. Their bodies were recovered and returned to their families with full military honors." The words hit Mitchell like physical blows, each name driving home the reality of what had happened on that mountain. These had been good soldiers, young men with families and futures ahead of them, and they had died under his command. The weight of responsibility settled on his shoulders like a lead blanket, heavier than any physical injury. "How?" he asked, dreading the answer but needing to know. "Intelligence reports indicate they held their position against overwhelming odds until their ammunition ran out," the nurse explained, her professional composure barely concealing her own emotions. "They fought bravely, Commander. Their sacrifice allowed you to survive long enough for rescue." Mitchell closed his eyes, trying to remember those final moments on the ledge. The details were hazy, but he could recall Torres throwing himself between Mitchell and an enemy fighter, taking a bullet meant for his commander. The young sergeant had died saving Mitchell's life, and that knowledge was more painful than any physical wound. "Who found me?" Mitchell asked after a long silence. The nurse consulted her chart before answering. "The official report states that you were located by a Special Operations Reconnaissance Team conducting surveillance in the area. They called in a medical evacuation helicopter that brought you here for treatment." But something in her tone suggested there was more to the story than what appeared in the official records. Mitchell had been in the military long enough to recognize when information was being carefully managed, and he suspected that the truth about his rescue was classified at levels above his clearance. Over the following days, as Mitchell's condition gradually improved, he received visits from various military officials who debriefed him about the mission and its outcome. A colonel from intelligence spent several hours going over every detail of the firefight, asking probing questions about the enemy's tactics and equipment. Mitchell answered as best he could, but many of his memories remained frustratingly unclear. It was during one of these debriefing sessions that Mitchell first heard mention of the mysterious sniper who had been operating in the region. The intelligence officer spoke carefully, clearly editing his words to avoid classified information, but the basic facts were intriguing. "There have been reports of a highly skilled marksman working independently in your area of operations," the colonel explained. 11 confirmed enemy kills over the past month, all high-value targets involved in attacks against coalition forces. The shooter appears to be using advanced equipment and demonstrates professional-level training. "One of ours?" Mitchell asked. The colonel shook his head. "Unknown. Could be a contractor, could be someone operating outside official channels. What's interesting is that this individual seems to be specifically targeting the same insurgent network that attacked your team." This information stuck with Mitchell as he began the long process of physical rehabilitation. The medical staff had warned him that he would need months of therapy to regain full use of his injured arm, and he might never return to active combat duty. But Mitchell was determined to heal as quickly as possible, driven by a need to understand what had really happened on that mountain and who had saved his life. 3 weeks into his recovery, Mitchell received an unexpected visitor. A woman in civilian clothes appeared in his room late one evening, moving with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to operating in dangerous places. She was average height with dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, but her eyes held the steady gaze of a professional warrior. "Commander Mitchell," she said, closing the door behind her and checking to make sure they were alone. "My name is Elena Vasquez. I think we need to talk." Mitchell studied her carefully, noting the way she positioned herself near the door and kept her hands free. This was clearly not a casual hospital visitor, and something about her seemed familiar despite the fact that he was certain they had never met. "Should I know you?" he asked carefully. Elena smiled slightly, pulling a chair close to his bed, but sitting where she could still watch the door. "We've never been formally introduced, but I was the one who found you at the bottom of that cliff. I'm the one who called in your medical evacuation." The revelation hit Mitchell like a bolt of lightning. This unassuming woman was his mysterious rescuer, the person who had saved his life when everyone else thought he was dead. He looked at her with new eyes, noting the calluses on her hands and the small scars that spoke of a life spent in dangerous places. "You're the sniper," he said, making it a statement rather than a question. Elena nodded. "I've been tracking the insurgent cell that killed your men. They've been responsible for at least a dozen attacks on coalition forces and civilian targets over the past 6 months. I was observing their position when they ambushed your team. Why didn't you intervene during the firefight?" Mitchell asked, not accusingly, but out of genuine curiosity. "By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late to affect the outcome," Elena explained. "My position was nearly a mile away, and even with my rifle, I could only engage a few targets before the others would take cover. Your team was already overrun." Elena reached into her jacket and pulled out a small digital camera, setting it on the bedside table where Mitchell could see the display screen. "But I did get detailed photographs of every fighter involved in the attack. I've been using them to systematically eliminate the network responsible for your men's deaths." She scrolled through a series of images showing various insurgent fighters, each photo marked with a date and location. Mitchell recognized several faces from the attack, including the commander who had ordered him thrown from the cliff. As Elena continued scrolling, he noticed that many of the photos had been marked with red X's. "How many?" Mitchell asked quietly. "7 so far," Elena replied without emotion, "including 3 who were directly involved in killing your soldiers. The others were part of the support network that provided weapons and intelligence to the attack cell." Mitchell stared at the photographs, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and unease. These men had murdered his soldiers in cold blood, and they deserved to face justice for their crimes. But the idea that someone was systematically hunting them down raised questions about the rules of engagement and proper legal procedures. "This is vigilante justice," he pointed out. Elena met his gaze steadily. "Sometimes vigilante justice is the only justice available. These men will never face trial in any court, Commander. They operate in regions where law enforcement doesn't exist, and they use that freedom to kill innocent people. Someone has to stop them." She closed the camera and returned it to her jacket. "I'm not asking for your approval or permission, Commander. I'm simply letting you know that your men's deaths have been avenged, and will continue to be avenged until every person responsible is dead." Before Mitchell could respond, Elena stood and moved toward the door. "Your doctors say you'll make a full recovery, but it will take time. Don't rush the process. The war will still be there when you're ready to return to it." She paused with her hand on the door handle, looking back at Mitchell with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Your team fought with extraordinary courage, Commander. They died as warriors, protecting their brothers to the end. You should be proud of them, and proud of the leader who inspired such loyalty." Then, Elena was gone, disappearing into the hospital corridor as quietly as she had arrived. Mitchell lay back against his pillows, processing everything she had told him. Part of him was disturbed by her methods, but a larger part was grimly satisfied knowing that his men's killers were facing their own form of justice. Over the following weeks, as Mitchell continued his recovery, he occasionally heard reports from the intelligence community about continued strikes against insurgent networks in his former area of operations. The mysterious sniper continued her work, eliminating targets with precision that impressed even seasoned professionals. Enemy fighters in the region had begun traveling in larger groups and avoiding exposed positions, but somehow the ghost marksman always found her targets. When Mitchell was finally released from the hospital and cleared to return to duty, He requested assignment back to Afghanistan despite medical recommendations that he accept a safer posting. His superiors were reluctant to approve the request, knowing that his injuries would prevent him from leading combat missions. But Mitchell was persistent. "Those mountains took something from me," he told the assignment officer during his final interview. "I need to go back and finish what we started." 3 months later, Commander David Mitchell found himself back in Afghanistan, assigned to an intelligence coordination role that kept him behind a desk, but allowed him to support field operations. It wasn't the frontline combat he preferred, but it gave him access to information about ongoing operations against the insurgent networks that had killed his men. Late one evening, while reviewing intelligence reports in his small office at Bagram Airfield, Mitchell noticed a familiar signature in the daily briefing. Another high-value target had been eliminated by unknown sniper fire, the 15th such death in the past 4 months. The victim was identified as the insurgent commander who had personally ordered Mitchell thrown from the cliff. Mitchell smiled grimly as he filed the report away. Somewhere out there in the Afghan mountains, Elena Vasquez was still hunting, still fighting her private war against those who preyed on the innocent. He might never see her again, but knowing she was out there gave him a sense of peace about his men's deaths. The war would continue, claiming more lives on both sides as it had for so many years. But sometimes, in the midst of all that death and destruction, justice found a way to balance the scales. Mitchell's team had died as heroes, and their killer had faced the consequences of his actions. In the brutal mathematics of war, it was the best outcome anyone could hope for. As Mitchell prepared to leave his office and return to his quarters, he took one last look at the map on his wall showing the region where his men had died. Somewhere out there, a legend was still being written in the shadows of the Afghan mountains, one precise shot at a time. The ghost sniper watched over American forces, ensuring that their sacrifices would not go unavenged. Commander David Mitchell had been saved by that legend, and he would spend the rest of his military career making sure others knew the story of the mysterious guardian who protected those who could not protect themselves. It was a debt that could never be fully repaid, but it was one he would carry with honor for the rest of his life.